Alright, team, so we're back, of course, with a couple of smaller updates for FF7 Rebirth. For one, a handful of days ago, we got the mid-year update from Metacritic for, like, the best games of 2024 so far, of course. And Rebirth is still number one. It's sitting at a 92 still, which I think is what it was the last time we talked about this. I think I did, like, a Game of the Year video a little while back or whatever. It's not a surprise that it's still in the number one spot. It's something we discussed, I think, with that video and probably other videos as well. There's just not really a ton of competition this year. You know, the kind of subject of that video was, will, Rebirth win Game of the Year? And what I talked about a lot in that video was that, like, it'd be cool if it did. Like, we want that. It's a W for FF7. It's a W for Final Fantasy. But it's also in a year without a ton of competition, right? There's, like, the only realistic contenders that I can think of are, like, Tekken 8, which it'd have to be a pretty fucking weird year for gaming for a fighting game to win Game of the Year. I'm not saying it won't be nominated, but for it to actually succeed and be the best game of the year would be pretty weird. Then you had, like, Helldivers 2, which had a little bit of controversy, but that was a massive success towards the beginning of the year, of course. You have Dragon's Dogma 2, which was kind of hyped up a little bit, but it did kind of fall off. And then in the future, you have, like, Black Myth Wukong, which a lot of people are hyping. I don't know enough about it to really talk about it, but I do know it's like kind of like a Souls-like game or something with monkeys, apes, something like that. I've seen a little bit of it. But those are, like, really the only kind of contenders, and besides that game in the future that could maybe be really, really good, they don't really compete with Rebirth. So again, to me, it's not a surprise that it's still the number one game of the year so far, and I'd be very surprised if it wasn't the actual game of the year by the end of 2024. They got a nice little write-up on Metacritic that we'll read really quickly. Metacritic's number one game of the first half of 2024, a PS5 exclusive that requires no prior knowledge of the vast Final Fantasy franchise. Rebirth is the second part following 2020's FF7 Remake, of a planned trilogy of standalone games reimagining the original 1997 version of Final Fantasy VII. Blending action, strategy, and RPG gameplay, the new game is set in a mostly open sci-fi world as your character, the mercenary Cloud Strife, sets off from the city of Midgar in search of the villainous Sephiroth. Critics think that it not only improves on Remake, but may also be the best Final Fantasy game to date. That last bit, though, potentially being the best Final Fantasy game to date, I think there's a conversation for that potentially. If we're just looking at metascores, for one, obviously, Final Fantasy IX is the highest rated Final Fantasy of all time. And initially, whenever Rebirth came out, it was a 93, which made it the second highest rated Final Fantasy of all time, but it has fallen down to 92. It seems to be about where it's sticking. And there are several other Final Fantasy games that are also 92. Final Fantasy 6, 7, 10, and 12 are all also 92s. So there's several Final Fantasies that are tied, at least Metascore-wise, with Rebirth, and one that's actually higher. Metascore's not everything, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Somebody wanted to say that they think that Rebirth is the best Final Fantasy of all time. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I think it's definitely the best we've had in a long time. Pretty much since the games that I mentioned that are on par with it in terms of Metascore. It's the best Final Fantasy we've had in a decade or two for sure. That's kind of the first bit of like info or news for Rebirth. I wanted to talk about it at some point. It's a few days old, but I just didn't know when and where to talk about it. So I didn't want to do just a video about that by itself. But moving on to the next thing. And what we have is that for 2024, at least in Japan, physical sales, Rebirth is the best-selling game for the first half of 2024. Which is a bit exciting, because we've heard kind of a little sort of conflicting stuff about Rebirth's performance, as in, like, it's not doing what Square Enix wants, but it's not necessarily doing bad, and the fact that it's, like, the number one game in Japan is at least something kind of exciting. What I will say, though, if you look at the actual list, it's almost like the Game of the Year thing, where, like, its competition is a little debatable. For example, the second best-selling game is Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and it's not that far behind Rebirth, and that came out October of last year, right? That game sold a fuck ton. Super Mario Bros. Wonder sold, like, 13 million from what I can find. It's, like, the fastest-selling Super Mario Bros. Game ever, and it's, not too far out from being a fucking year old, and it's still selling physically on par with Rebirth. In fact, a couple other games in the top 5 best-selling games in Japan so far this year are kind of older games. The third place game is Momotaro Dentetsu World, which came out like November of last year. And the fourth best-selling game this year so far in Japan is fucking Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which came out in like 2017. If you want to be technical, Mario Kart 8 came out on the Wii U in 2014. That shit's like 10 years old, dude. The point is, like, the games that Rebirth is competing against, similar to the Game of the Year shit, aren't really competition, right? Because if you push Super Mario Bros. Wonder to, like, January 1st, if, like, that's when the game came out, this year, actually, it would fucking decimate Rebirth. It sold, like, 4 million in the first couple weeks, and by March of this year, it sold 13 goddamn million. I'm not even sure if by the end of the remake trilogy itself will it even reach 13 million. And look, I know the Mario series is very, very popular in general, and specifically in Japan, the Switch is very, very popular. So that's obviously a big part of why the game's still selling very well. But the point is, like, if there's any real competition this year, like any sort of major releases, similar to the Game of the Year discussion I keep going back to, like Rebirth probably wouldn't be at the top. And to be clear, I'm not trying to shit on Rebirth, because again, I think it's a fantastic game. One of the best Final Fantasies we've had in like 20 years probably. But I'm just trying to be a realist, right? Because people are like being really hyped about this, and to a certain degree they should be. But, you know, people, I could show you fucking replies on Twitter, people being excited about it. Like, people said that Rebirth was doing terribly, but look at this, and Rebirth is beating Mario, and Mario is very, very popular. And it's like, whoa. Let's push it into perspective really quickly, because it's not beating Mario. It's not doing better than fucking Super Mario Bros. Wonder. We're great to see that Rebirth is doing well in Japan, right? Like, 300,000 physical sales in one location is never a bad thing. And you got to assume that it's doing like similar-ish numbers in other countries, right? It's probably sold that or more, maybe a little less, whatever, in like US and maybe like the UK or something like that. And that's not even factoring in digital sales, right? Like, I'm very curious. I wish they'd be more open about it. Like, it's more telling that they're not talking about the overall sales of Rebirth, right? They're not saying like, this is the milestone we're at now, and this is where we're at now a couple months later. Like, the fact that they're being so fucking vague with it, it's like they were with Remake, is very, very telling. It's one of those things that makes you wonder how different the Remake trilogy would have been if, at least for the second game, had they stuck to the PS4. Because, like, getting people in on the ground floor of the Remake project, the Remake trilogy, with the PS4, and then immediately hop into the PS5, it's kind of crazy. And had development, like, went more smoothly for the first game, that might have happened, right? Because it got revealed in 2015, but didn't release until 2020. And, like, 2 years of development were potentially maybe, like, sort of wasted with CyberConnect 2, and they brought development in-house in 2017, right? So, like, if Remake, the first game, had been made in like a timely manner, we might have also had the second game on PS4, and obviously it would have been very different from what Rebirth is right now. But you would have at least had like two games of the trilogy on the PS4. You get that massive like, you know, player base that are playing the Remake trilogy, and then maybe you go to the PS5 only for the third game. I don't know. It's just one of those things that makes you wonder. Part of why the games that we're talking about today are successful, like with the top-selling games of the year or whatever in Japan, are because they're on fucking older gen hardware, dude. Like, maybe they're held back by a certain degree by still being on the Switch and not on some new Nintendo console, but who gives a shit when Super Mario Bros. Wonder is selling 13, 14 million goddamn units? Like, that's all that goddamn matters, realistically, right? And even if the second Remake game would have been hindered in some capacity by being only on PS4 and not PS5, it still could have been a good game. People act like, whenever a new generation comes out, people act like the old generation's just dog shit. Like, there's just no good games on PS4, right? It's the weirdest thing to me. Like, there still could have been a good second Remake game on PS4. There's also other factors that go into the shit, like exclusivity and things like that, right? There's just not, like, that massive of, like, a player base on PS5 only that want to play specifically FF7 Rebirth, right? Like, there's a lot of things there. If, like, Rebirth came out on PC day one for sure, that would have massively helped it. Anyways, we're going on a bit of a tangent here. We're kind of trailing off, which we tend to do somewhat often on the channel. It's not really the focus of the video. Overall, though, it seems like, you know, Rebirth physically is doing pretty well in Japan. I wonder how it's doing in other countries. I wonder if we'll get that kind of update at some point. How many physical units have been sold in, like, the US and shit like that. Also wonder when we're next going to get, like, a milestone update for Rebirth in terms of, like, the next, you know, it's up to 4 million or 5 million units sold or something like that. It might not be until the PC version releases. I'm kind of wondering when that's going to happen, too, because we're already a little ways out from when the exclusivity was supposed to end for Rebirth, so you gotta think that there's gotta be a PC announcement sometime soonish. Anyways, that's the video, my dudes. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @DavidYT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain, or leave it like Cobain.